All right. What's up, everybody? I'm back. Page three. All right, we're on page 313, chapter 7, Finance, Commercial Policy, and Business Activity, 1897 to 1947. This ought to be like super interesting. Reflation and inflation, 1897 to 1925. The period of stabilization, 1922 to 1930. The period of deflation, 1927 to 1936. Reflation and inflation, 1933 to 1947. All right. Reflation and inflation, 1897 to 1925 on page 315. We have already seen that valiant efforts were made in the period 1919 to 1929 to build up an international political order quite different from that which had existed in the 19th century. On the basis of the old order of sovereignty and international law, men attempted, without complete conviction of purpose, to build a new international order of collective security. We have seen that this effort was a failure. The causes of this failure are to be found, to some degree, in the fact that these statesmen had built the new order in a far from perfect fashion, with inadequate understanding, improper plans, poor materials, and faulty tools. But the failure can be attributed to a much greater degree to the fact that the resulting political structure was exposed to the stress of an economic storm which few had foreseen. Collective security was destroyed by the world economic depression more than by any other single cause. The economic depression made possible the rise to power of Hitler, and this made possible the aggressions of Italy and Japan and made Britain adopt the policy of appeasement. For these reasons, a real understanding of the economic history of 20th century Europe is imperative to any understanding of the events of the period. Such an understanding will require a study of the history of finance, commerce, and business activity, of industrial organization, and of agriculture. The first three of these will be considered in this chapter from the beginning of the 20th century to the establishment of the pluralist economy about 1947. The whole of this half century may be divided into 6 subdivisions as follows. Reflation, 1897 to 1914. Inflation, 1914 to 1925. Stabilization, 1922 to 1930. Deflation, 1927 to 1936. Reflation, 1933 to 1939. Inflation, 1939 to 1947. These periods have different dates in different countries, and thus overlap if we take the widest periods to include all important countries. But in spite of the difference in dates, these periods occurred in almost every country and in the same order. It should also be pointed out that these periods were interrupted by haphazard secondary movements. Of course, these secondary movements, the chief were the Depression of 1921 to 1922 and the recession of 1937 to 1938. Both periods of deflation and declining economic activity. Prices had been slowly rising from about 1897 because of the increased output of gold from South Africa and Alaska, thus alleviating the depressed conditions and agricultural distress which had prevailed to the benefit of financial capitalists from 1873. The outbreak of war in 1914 showed these financial capitalists at their worst, narrow in outlook, ignorant, and selfish, while proclaiming, as usual, their total devotion to the social good. They generally agreed that the war could not go on for more than 6 to 10 months because of the limited financial resources of the belligerents, by which they meant gold reserves. This idea reveals the fundamental misunderstanding of the nature and role of money on the part of the very persons who were reputed to be experts on the subject. Wars, as events have proved since, are not fought with gold or even with money, but by the proper organization of real resources. The attitudes of bankers were revealed most clearly in England, where every move was dictated by efforts to protect their own position and to profit from it, rather than by considerations of economic mobilization for war or the welfare of the British people. The outbreak of war on August 4, 1914, found the British banking system insolvent in the sense that its funds, created by the banking system for profit and rented out to the economic system to permit it to operate, could not be covered by the existing volume of gold reserves or by collateral which could be liquidated rapidly. Accordingly, the bankers secretly devised a scheme by which their obligations could be met by fiat money, so-called treasury notes, but as soon as that crisis was over, they then insisted that the government must pay for the war without recourse to fiat money, which was always damned by bankers as immoral, but by taxation and by borrowing at high interest rates from bankers. The decision to use treasury notes to fulfill the bankers' liabilities was made as early as Saturday, July 25, 1914, by Sir John Bradbury, later Lord Bradbury, and Sir Frederick Atterbury at the latter's house. The first treasury notes were run off the presses at Waterlow and Sons the following Tuesday, July 28th, at the time when most politicians believed that Britain would stay out of the war. The usual bank holiday at the beginning of August was extended to 3 days, during which it was announced that the treasury notes, instead of gold, would be used for bank payments. The discount rate was raised at the Bank of England from 3% to 10% to prevent inflation, a figure taken merely because the traditional rule of the bank stated that a 10% bank rate would draw gold out of the ground itself, and gold payments need to be suspended only when 10% rate failed. At the outbreak of the war, most of the belligerent countries suspended gold payments and, to varying degrees, accepted their bankers' advice that the proper way to pay for the war was by a combination of bank loans with taxation of consumption. The period within which, according to the experts, the war must cease because of limited financial resources eventually passed, and the fighting continued more vigorously than ever. The governments paid for it in various ways: by taxation, by fiat money, by borrowing from banks which created credit for the purpose, and by borrowing from the people by selling war bonds to them. Each of these methods of raising money had a different effect upon the two chief financial consequences of the war. These were inflation and public debt. The effects of the four ways of raising money upon these two can be seen from the following table. Taxation gives no inflation and no debt. Fiat money gives inflation and no debt. Bank credit gives inflation and debt. Sales of bonds gives no inflation but give debt. It would appear from this table that the best way to pay for war would be by taxation, and the worst way would be by bank credit. However, taxation sufficient to pay for a major war would have such a severe deflationary effect upon prices that economic production would not increase enough or fast enough. Any rapid increase in production is spurred by a small amount of inflation, which provides the impetus of unusual profits to the economic system. Increase in public debt, on the other hand, contributes little of value to the effort toward economic mobilization. From this point of view, it is not easy to say what method of financing a war is best. Probably the best is a combination of the four methods, mixed in such a way that the end there is a minimum of debt and no more inflation than was necessary to obtain complete and rapid economic mobilization. This would probably involve a combination of fiat money and taxation with considerable sales of bonds to individuals, the combination varying at different stages in the mobilization effort. In the period 1914 to 1918, the various belligerents used a mixture of these four methods, but it was a mixture dictated by expediency and false theories, so that at the end of the war all the countries found themselves with both public debts and inflation in amounts in no wise justified by the degree of economic mobilization which had been achieved. The situation was made worse by the fact that in all countries prices continued to rise, and in most countries public debts continued to rise long after the armistice of 1918. The causes of the wartime inflation are to be found in both financial and economic spheres. In the financial sphere, government spending was adding tremendous amounts of money to the financial community, largely to produce goods which would never be offered for sale. In the economic sphere, the situation was different in those countries which were more completely mobilized than in those which were only partially mobilized. In the former, real wealth was reduced by the diversion of economic resources from making such wealth to making goods for destruction. In the others, the total quantity of real wealth may not have been seriously reduced, since much of the resources utilized in making goods for destruction came from the resources previously unused, like idle mines, idle factories, idle men, and so on. But the increase in the money supply competing for the limited amount of real wealth gave drastic rise in prices. While prices in most countries rose 200 to 300% and public debts rose 1,000%, the financial leaders tried to keep up the pretense that the money of each country was as valuable as it had ever been, and that as soon as the war ended, the situation existing in 1914 would be restored. For this reason, they did not openly abandon the gold standard. Instead, they suspended certain attributes of the gold standard and emphasized the other attributes which they had tried to maintain. In most countries, payments in gold and exports of gold were suspended, but every effort was made to keep gold reserves up to a respectable percentage of notes, and exchanges were controlled to keep them as near parity as possible. These attributes were achieved in some cases by deceptive methods. In Britain, for example, the gold reserve against notes fell from 52% to 18% in the month July through August 1914. Then the situation was concealed, partly by moving assets of local banks into the Bank of England and using them as reserves for both, partly by issuing a new kind of notes called currency notes, which had no real reserve and little gold backing. In the United States, the percentage of reserves required by law in commercial banks was reduced in 1914, and the reserve requirements both for notes and deposits were cut in June 1917. A new system of depositary bank was set up which required no reserves against government deposits created in them in return for government bonds. Such efforts were made in all countries, but everywhere the ratio of gold reserves to notes fell drastically during the war. In France from 60% to 11%, in Germany from 59% to 10%, in Russia from 98% to 2%, in Italy from 60% to 13%, in Britain from 15% to 32%. Inflation and increase in public debts continued after the war ended. The causes for this were complicated and varied from country to country. In general, 1. Price fixing and rationing regulations were ended too soon, before the output of peacetime goods had risen to a level high enough to absorb the accumulating purchasing power in the hands of customers from their efforts in war production. Thus, the slowness of reconversion from war production to peace production caused a short supply at the time of high demand. 2. The Allied exchanges, which had been controlled during the war, were unpegged in March 1919 and at once fell to levels revealing the great price disequilibrium between countries. 3. Purchasing power held back during the war suddenly came into market. 4. There was an expansion of bank credit because of post-war optimism. 5. Budgets remained out of balance because of reconstruction requirements as in France or Belgium, reparations as in Germany, demobilization expenses as in the United States, Italy, and so on. And 6. Production of peacetime goods was disrupted by revolutions as in Hungary, Russia, and so on, or strikes as in the United States, Italy, France, and so on. Unfortunately, this post-war inflation, which could have accomplished much good by increasing output of real wealth, was wasted by increasing prices of existing goods and had evil results by destroying capital accumulations and savings and overturning economic class lines. This failure was caused by the fact that inflation, though unwanted everywhere, was uncontrollable because few persons in positions of power had the courage to take the steps necessary to curtail it. In the defeated and revolutionary countries, Russia, Poland, Hungary, Austria, and Germany, the inflation went so far that the former monetary units became valueless and ceased to exist. In a second group of countries like France, Belgium, and Italy, the value of the monetary unit was so reduced that it became a different thing, although the same name was still used. In a third group of countries, Britain, the United States, and Japan, the situation was kept under control. As far as Europe was concerned, the intensity of the inflation increased as one moved geographically from west to east. Of the three groups of countries above, the second, moderate inflation group, was the most fortunate. In the first extreme inflation group, the inflation wiped out all public debts, all savings, and all claims on wealth, since the monetary unit became valueless. In the moderate inflation group, the burden of public debt was reduced, and private debts and savings were reduced by the same proportion. In the United States and Britain, the effort to fight inflation took the form of a deliberate movement towards deflation. This preserved savings but increased the burden of the public debt and gave economic depression. Okay, so this is page 320, the period of stabilization, 1922 to 1930. As soon as the war was finished, governments began to turn their attention to the problem of restoring the pre-war financial system. Since the essential element in that system was believed to be the gold standard with its stable exchanges, this movement was called stabilization. Because of their eagerness to restore the pre-war financial situation, the experts closed their eyes to the tremendous changes which had resulted from the war. These changes were so great in production, in commerce, and in financial habits that any efforts to restore the pre-war conditions or even stabilize on the gold standard was impossible and inadvisable. Instead of seeking a financial system adapted to the new economic and commercial world which had emerged from the war, the experts tried to ignore this world and established a financial system which looked, superficially, much like the pre-war system as possible. This system, however, was not the pre-war system. Neither was it adapted to the new economic conditions. When the experts began to have vague glimmerings of this last fact, they did not begin to modify their goals, but insisted on the same goals and voiced incantations and exhortations against the existing conditions which made the attainment of their goals impossible. These changed economic conditions could not be controlled or exercised by incantations. They were basically not results of the war at all, but normal outcomes of the economic development of the world in the 19th century. All that the war had done was to speed up the rate of this development. The economic changes in which 1925 made it so difficult to restore the financial system of 1914 were already discernible in 1890 and clearly evident by 1910. The chief item in these changes was the decline of Britain. What had happened was that the Industrial Revolution was spreading beyond Britain to Europe and the United States, and by 1910 to South America and Asia. As a result, these areas became less dependent on Britain for manufactured goods, less eager to sell their raw materials and food products to her, and became her competitors both in selling to and in buying from those colonial areas to which industrialism had not yet spread. By 1914, Britain's supremacy as financial center, as commercial market, as creditor, and as merchant shipper was being threatened. A less obvious threat arose from long-run shifts in demand shifts from the products of heavy industry to the products of more highly specialized branches of production like chemicals, from cereals to fruits and dairy products, from cotton and wool to silk and rayon, from leather to rubber, and so on. These changes presented Britain with a fundamental choice, either to yield her supremacy in the world or reform her industrial and commercial system to cope with the new conditions. The latter was difficult because Britain had allowed her industrial system to become lopsided under the influence of free trade and international division of labor. Over half the employed persons in Britain were engaged in the manufacture of textiles and ferrous metals. Textiles accounted for over 1/3 of her exports, and textiles, along with iron and steel, for over 1/2. At the same time, newer industrial nations, Germany, the United States, and Japan, were growing rapidly with industrial systems better adapted to the trend of the times, and these were also cutting deeply into Britain's supremacy in merchant shipping. At this critical stage in Britain's development, the World War occurred. This had a double result as far as this subject is concerned. It forced Britain to postpone indefinitely any reform of her industrial system to adjust it to more modern trends, and it speeded up the development of these trends so that what might have occurred in 20 years was done instead in 5. In the period 1910 to 1920, Britain's merchant fleet fell by 6% in number of vessels, while that of the United States went up 57%, that of Japan went up 130%, and that of the Netherlands went up 58%. Her position as the world's greatest creditor was lost to the United States, and a large quantity of good foreign credits was replaced by a smaller amount of poorer risks. In addition, she became a debtor to the United States to the amount of over $4 billion. The change in the position of the two countries can be summarized briefly. The war changed the position of the United States in respect to the rest of the world from that of a debtor owing about $3 billion to that of a creditor owed $4 billion. This does not include intergovernmental debts of about $10 billion owed to the United States as a result of the war. At that same time, Britain's position changed from a creditor owed about $18 billion to a creditor owed about $13.5 billion. In addition, Britain was owed about $8 billion in war debts from her allies and an unknown sum in reparations from Germany, and owed to the United States war debts of well over $4 billion. Most of these war debts and reparations were sharply reduced after 1920, but the net result for Britain was a drastic change in her position in respect to the United States. The basic economic organization of the world was modified in other ways. As a result of the war, The old organization of relatively free commerce among countries specializing in different types of production was replaced by a situation in which larger numbers of countries sought economic self-sufficiency by placing restrictions on commerce. In addition, productive capacity in both agriculture and industry had been increased by the artificial demands of the war period to a degree far beyond the ability of normal domestic demand to buy the products of that capacity. And finally, the more backwards areas of Europe and the war had been industrialized to a great degree and were unwilling to fall back to a position in which they would obtain industrial products from Britain, Germany, or the United States in return for their raw material goods. This refusal was made more painful for both sides by the fact that these backwards areas had increased their outputs of raw materials and food so greatly that the total could hardly have been sold even if they had been willing to buy all their industrial products from their pre-war sources. These pre-war sources in turn had increased their industrial capacity so greatly that the product could hardly have been sold if they had been able to recapture entirely all their pre-war markets. The result was a situation where all countries were eager to sell and reluctant to buy, and sought to achieve these mutually irreconcilable ends by setting up subsidies and bounties on exports, tariffs, and restrictions on imports, with disastrous results on world trade. The only sensible solution to this problem of excessive productive capacity would have been a substantial rise in domestic standard of living. This would have required a fundamental reapportionment of the national income so that claims to the product of excess capacity would go to these masses eager to consume rather than continue to go to a minority desiring to save. Such a reform was rejected by the ruling groups in both advanced and backwards countries, so that this solution was reached only to a relatively small degree in a relatively few countries, chiefly the United States and Germany in the period 1925 to 1929. Changes in the basic productive and commercial organization of the world in the period 1914 to 1919 were made more difficult to adjust by other less tangible changes in financial practices and business psychology. The spectacular post-war inflations in Europe had intensified the traditional fear of inflation among bankers. In an effort to stop rises in prices which might become inflationary, bankers after 1919 increasingly sought to sterilize gold when it flowed into their country. That is, they sought to set it aside so that it did not become part of the monetary system. As a result, the unbalance of trade which initiated the flow of gold was not counteracted by price changes. Trade and prices remained unbalanced, and gold continued to flow. Somewhat similar was a spreading fear of decreasing gold reserves, so that when gold began to flow out of the country as a result of an unfavorable balance of international payments, bankers increasingly sought to hinder the flow by restrictions on gold exports. With such actions, the unfavorable balance of trade continued, and other countries were inspired to take retaliatory actions. The situation was also disturbed by political fears and by the military ambitions of certain countries, since these frequently resulted in a desire for self-sufficiency, autocracy, such as could be obtained only by the use of tariffs, subsidies, quotas, and trade controls. Somewhat related to this was the widespread increase in feelings of economic, political, and social insecurity. This gave rise to flights of capital, that is, to panic transfers of holding, seeking a secure spot regardless of economic return. Moreover, the situation was disturbed by the arrival in the foreign exchange market of a very large number of relatively ignorant speculators. In the period before 1914, speculators in foreign exchange had been a small group of men whose activities were based on long experience with the market and had a stabilizing effect on it. After 1919, large numbers of persons with neither knowledge nor experience began to speculate in foreign exchange. Subject to the influence of rumors, hearsay, and mob panic, their activities had a very disturbing effect on the markets. Finally, within each country, the decline in competition arising from the growth of labor unions, cartels, monopolies, and so on made prices less responsive to flows of gold or exchange in the international markets, and as a result, such flows did not set into motion these forces which would equalize prices between countries, curtail flows of gold, and balance flows of goods. As a result of all these factors, the system of international payments, which had worked so beautifully before 1914, worked only haltingly after that date and practically ceased to work after 1930. The chief cause of these factors was that neither goods nor money obeyed purely economic forces and did not move as formerly to these areas in which each was most valuable. Oh, so what? Capitalism doesn't actually work? The chief result was a complete maldistribution of gold, a condition which became acute after 1928 and by 1933 had forced most countries off the gold standard. Modification of productive and commercial organization and of financial practices made it almost impossible after 1919 to restore the financial system of 1914. Yet this is what was attempted. Instead of seeking to set up a new financial organization adapted to the modified economic organization, bankers and politicians insisted that the old pre-war system should be restored. So they're basically like boomers. These efforts were concentrated in a determination to restore the gold standard as it had existed in 1914. In addition to these pragmatic goals, the powers of financial capitalism had another far-reaching aim, nothing less than to create a world system of financial control in private hands able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. Okay, post a note on that. It kind of sounds like a conspiracy to me to control the world's economic system. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they're not trying to control the world. They're just writing about it in this book. This system was to be controlled in a feudalist fashion by the central banks of the world, acting in concert by secret agreements arrived at in frequent private meetings and consequences. World Economic Forum, anyone? This is page 324. The apex of the system was to be the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland, a private bank owned and controlled by the world's central banks, which were themselves private corporations. People keep going, oh, but it's the government, bro. You're getting it wrong. It's just a trick. It's just a trick. It's really the government. The central banks are really work for the government. No, they don't. No, they don't. It's actually a private corporation. Each central bank, in the hands of men like Montague Norman of the Bank of England, Benjamin Strong of the New York Federal Reserve Bank, Charles Rist of the Bank of France, and Hjalmar Schacht of Reichsbank, sought to dominate its government by its ability to control treasury loans, to manipulate foreign exchanges, to influence the level of economic activity in the country, and to influence cooperative politicians by subsequent economic rewards in the business world. I mean, this is what's happening right now. Wow. I mean, this book is really like fake news. In each country, the power of the central bank rested largely on its control of credit and money supply. In the world as a whole, the power of the central bankers rested very largely on their control of loans and of gold flows. In the final days of the system, these central bankers were able to mobilize resources to assist each other through the BIS, where payments between central banks could be made by bookkeeping adjustments between the accounts which the central banks of the world kept there. The Bank for International Settlements, as a private institution, was owned by the 7 chief central banks and was operated by the heads of those who together formed its governing board. Each of these kept a substantial deposit at the Bank for International Settlements and periodically settled payments among themselves and thus between the major countries of the world by bookkeeping in order to avoid shipments of gold. So the largest bank in the world basically doesn't have any money. They just do bookkeeping. They made agreement on all the major financial problems of the world, as well as on many of the economic and political problems, especially in reference to loans, payments, and the economic future of the chief areas of the globe. The Bank for International Settlements is generally regarded as the apex of the structure of financial capitalism, whose remote origins go back to the creation of the Bank of England in 1694 and the Bank of France in 1803. As a matter of fact, its establishment in 1929 was rather an indication that the centralized world financial system of 1914 was in decline. It was set up rather to remedy the decline of London as the world's financial center by providing a mechanism by which a world with 3 chief financial centers in London, New York, and Paris could still operate as one. The BIS was a vain effort to cope with the problems arising from the growth of a number of centers. It was intended to be a world cartel of ever-growing national financial powers by assembling the nominal heads of these national financial centers. The commander-in-chief of the world system of banking was Montague Norman, the governor of the Bank of England, who was built up by the private bankers to a position where he was regarded as an oracle in all matters of government and business. In government, the power of the Bank of England was a considerable restriction on political action as early as 1819, but an effort to break this power by a modification of the bank's charter in 1844 failed. In 1852, Gladstone, then Chancellor of the Exchequer and later Prime Minister, declared, "The hinge of the whole situation was this: the government itself was not to be a substantive power in matters of finance, but was to leave the money power supreme and unquestioned." Wow. The power of the Bank of England and of its governor was admitted by most qualified observers. In January 1924, Reginald McKenna, who had been Chancellor of the Exchequer in 1915 to 1916, as chairman of the board of the Midland Bank, told its stockholders, "I am afraid the ordinary citizen will not like to be told that the banks can do and do create money, and they who control the credit of the nation direct the policy of governments and hold in the hollow of their hands the destiny of the people." In that same year, Sir Drummond Fraser, vice president of the Institute of Bankers, stated, "The governor of the Bank of England must be the autocrat who dictates the terms upon which alone the government can obtain borrowed money." On September 26, 1921, the Financial Times wrote, "Half a dozen men at the top of the big 5 banks could upset the whole fabric of government finance by refraining from renewing treasury bills." Vincent Vickers, who had been a director of the bank for 9 years, said, "Since 1919, the monetary policy of the government has been the policy of the Bank of England, and the policy of the Bank of England has been the policy of Mr. Montague Norman." On November 11, 1927, the Wall Street Journal called Mr. Norman the currency dictator of Europe. This fact was admitted by Norman himself before the court of the bank on March 21st, 1930, and before the Macmillan Committee 5 days later. Montague Norman's position may be gathered from the fact that his predecessors in the governorship, almost 100 of them, had served 2-year terms, increased rarely in the time of crisis to 3 or even 4 years. But Norman held the position for 24 years, from 1924 to 1944, during which he became the chief architect of the liquidation of Britain's global preeminence. Norman was a strange man whose mental outlook was one of successful suppressed hysteria or even paranoia. He had no use for governments and feared democracy. Both of these seemed to him to be threats to private banking and thus to all that was proper and precious in human life. Strong-willed, tireless, and ruthless, he viewed his life as a kind of cloak-and-dagger struggle with forces of unsound money, which were in league with anarchy and communism. When he rebuilt the Bank of England, he constructed it as a fortress prepared to defend itself against any popular revolt, with the sacred gold reserves hidden in deep vaults below the level of underground waters, which could be released to cover them by pressing a button on the governor's desk. For much of his life, Norman rushed about the world by fast steamship, covering tens of thousands of miles each year, often traveling incognito, concealed by a black slouch hat and a long black cloak. Under the assumed name Professor Skinner, his embarkations and debarkations onto and off of the fastest ocean liners of the day, sometimes through the freight hatch, were about as unobserved as the somewhat similar passages of Greta Garbo in the same year, and were carried out in a similarly sincere effort at self-effacement. Norman had a devoted colleague in Benjamin Strong, the first governor of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Strong owed his career to the favor of the Morgan Bank, especially of Henry P. Davison, who made him Secretary of the Bankers Trust Company of New York, in succession to Thomas W. Lamont in 1904, used him as Morgan's agent in the banking rearrangement following the crash of 1907, and made him Vice President of the Bankers Trust, still in succession to Lamont in 1909. He became governor of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York as the joint nominees of Morgan and of Kuhn, Loeb, and Company in 1914. 2 years later, Strong met Norman for the first time, and they at once made an agreement to work in cooperation for the financial practices they both revered. These financial practices were explicitly stated many times in the voluminous correspondence between the two men and in many conversations they had, both in their work and at their leisure. They often spent their vacations together for weeks, usually in the south of France. In the 1920s, they were determined to use the financial power of Britain and of the United States to force all major countries of the world to go on the gold standard and to operate it through central banks free from all political control, even though they're the ones in control, with all questions of international finance to be settled by agreements by such central banks without interference from governments. It must not be felt that these heads of the world's chief central banks were themselves substantive powers in the world finance. They were not. Rather, they were the technicians and agents of the dominant investment bankers of their own countries who had raised them up and were perfectly capable of throwing them down. See, that's another point where it's like people are like, these people are not in charge. The people that you see in the front, You see politicians and these bankers and all those people, if you see them in public and they're in the news, they're not the people that are actually in charge. The substantive financial powers of the world were in the hands of these investment bankers, also called international or merchant bankers, who remained largely behind the scenes in their own unincorporated private banks. These formed a system of international cooperation and national dominance which was more private, more powerful, and more secret than that of their agents in the central banks. This dominance of investment bankers was based on their control over the flows of credit and investment funds in their own countries and throughout the world. They could dominate the financial and industrial systems of their own countries by their influence over the flow of currency funds through the bank loans, the discount rate, and the rediscounting of commercial debts. So basically, the interest rate is the discount rate. And the rediscounting of commercial debts. They could dominate governments by their control over current government loans and the play of the international exchanges. Almost all of this power was exercised by the personal influence and prestige of men who had demonstrated their ability in the past to bring off successful financial coups, to keep their word, to remain cool in a crisis, and to share their winning opportunities with their associates. In this system, the Rothschilds had been preeminent during much of the 19th century, but at the end of that century, they were being replaced by J.P. Morgan, whose central office was in New York, although it was always operated as if it were in London, where it had, indeed, originated as George Peabody and Company in 1838. Old J.P. Morgan died in 1913, but was succeeded by his own son of the same name, who had been trained in the London branch until 1901. While the chief decisions in the firm were increasingly made by Thomas W. Lamont after 1924. But these relationships can be described better on a national basis later. At the present stage, we must follow the efforts of the central bankers to compel the world to return to the gold standard of 1914 in the post-war conditions following 1918. The bankers' point of view was clearly expressed in a series of government reports and international conferences from 1918 to 1933. Among these were the reports of the Cunliffe Committee of Great Britain, August 1918, that of the Brussels Conference of Experts, September 1920, that of the Genoa Conference of the Supreme Council, January 1922, the First World Economic Conference at Geneva, May 1927, the report of the Macmillan Committee on Finance and Industry of 1931, and the various statements released by the World Economic Conference at London in 1933. These and many other statements and reports called vainly for a free international gold standard, for balanced budgets, for restoration of the exchange rates and reserve ratios customary before 1914, for reductions in taxes and government spending, and for a cessation of all government interference in economic activity, either domestic or international. But none of these studies made any effort to assess the fundamental changes in economic, commercial, and political life since 1914, and none gave any indication of a realization that a financial system must adapt itself to such changes. Instead, they all implied that if men would only give up their evil ways and impose the financial system of 1914 on the world, the changes would be compelled to reverse their decision and go back to the conditions of 1914. Accordingly, the financial efforts of the period after 1918 became concentrated on a very simple and superficial goal: to get back to the gold standard, not a gold standard, but the gold standard, by which was meant the identical exchange ratios and gold contents that monetary units had in 1914. Restoration of the gold standard was not something which could be done by a mere act of government. It was admitted by even the most ardent advocates of the gold standard that certain financial relationships would require adjustment before the gold standard could be restored. There were three chief relationships involved. These were 1. The problem of inflation, or the relationship between money and goods, the problem of public debts, or the relationship between governmental income and expenditure, and 3. The problem of price parities, or the relationship between price levels of different countries. That these three problems existed was evidence of a fundamental disequilibrium between real wealth and claims on wealth caused by a relative decrease in the former and increase in the latter. The problem of public debts arose from the fact that as money credit was created during the war period, it was usually made in such a way that it was not in the control of the state or the community, but was in the control of private financial institutions which demanded real wealth at some future date for the creation of claims on wealth in the present. The problem of public debt could have been met in one or more of several fashions. A. By increasing the amount of real wealth in the community so that its price would fall and the value of money would rise. This would restore the old equilibrium and price level between real wealth and claims on wealth, and that at the same time would permit payment of the public debt with no increases in the tax rates. B. By devaluation, that is, reduce the gold content of the monetary unit so that the government's holdings of gold would be worth a greatly increased number of monetary units. These latter could be applied to the public debt. C. By repudiation, that is, a simple cancellation of the public debt by a refusal to pay it. By taxation, that is, by increasing the tax rate to a level high enough to yield enough income to pay off the public debt. E. By the issuance of fiat money and the payment of the debt by such money. These methods were not mutually exclusive and in some cases overlapped. It might, for example, be argued that devaluation or use of fiat money were forms of partial repudiation. Nor were all these methods equally practical. For example, the first, increase real wealth, was by far the soundest method to achieve a restabilization, but no one saw how to accomplish it. The fourth, taxation, would have put a burden on the economic system so great as to be self-defeating. In Britain, the public debt could have been paid only by a tax of 25% for about 300 years. Such heavy taxes might have had such a depressing effect on production of real wealth that national income would decline faster than tax rates rose, making payment by taxation impossible. Nor were all these alternative methods of paying the public debt of equal practicality in respect to their effects on the two other financial problems occupying the minds of experts and statesmen. These other two problems were inflation and price parities. These problems were just as urgent as the public debt, and the effects upon them of the different methods for paying the public debt could have been completely different. Efforts to pay the public debt by fiat money would have made the inflation problem and perhaps the price parity problem worse. Taxation and increasing real wealth, on the other hand, would have reduced the inflation problem at the same time as they reduced the public debt, since both would have increased the value of money, that is, they were deflationary. Their effects on the problem of price parity would differ from case to case. Finally, these methods of paying the public debt were not of equal value in theory. Orthodox theory rejected repudiation, devaluation, and fiat money as solutions to the problem, and, since it showed no way of increasing the production of real wealth, only taxation was left as a possible method of paying public debts. See, if you can't increase production, then they just tax you more, right? And if you can't increase production when you work a wage job. But theorists, as we have shown, could call taxation a possible way only if they neglected the economic consequences. These consequences in most countries were so disastrous that taxation, if tried, soon had to be supplemented by other unorthodox methods. Great Britain and the United States were the only powers which continued to use taxation as the chief method of paying public debt. Notice this all happened in 1913. Then they decided to bring in the income tax, right? Like it was all connected. The second problem, which had to be faced before stabilization was possible, was the problem of inflation. This was caused by the great increase in claims on wealth, money, and showed itself in a drastic increase in prices. There were three possible solutions: A, to increase the production of real wealth, B, to decrease the quantity of money, or C, to devaluate or to make each unit of money equal to a smaller amount of wealth, specifically gold. The first two would have forced prices back to the lower pre-war level, but would have done it in an entirely different ways. One resulting in prosperity and a great rise in standard of living, the second resulting in depression and a great fall in standard of living. The third method, devaluation, was essentially a recognition and acceptance of the existing situation and would have left prices at the higher post-war level permanently. This would have involved a permanent reduction in the value of money and also would have given different parities in foreign exchanges unless there was international agreement that countries devaluate by the same ratio. But it would have made possible prosperity and a rising standard of living and would have accepted as permanent the redistribution of wealth from creditors to debtors brought by the wartime inflation. Since the third method, devaluation, was rejected by orthodox theorists, and no one could see how to get the first, increase of real wealth, only the second, deflation, was left as a possible method for dealing with the problem of inflation. To many people, it seemed axiomatic that the cure for inflation was deflation, especially since bankers regarded deflation as a good thing in itself. Moreover, deflation as a method for dealing with the problem of inflation went hand in hand with taxation as a method for dealing with the problem of public debts. Theorists did not stop to think what the effects of both would be on the production of real wealth and on the prosperity of the world. The third financial problem, which had to be resolved before stabilization became practical, was the problem of price parities. This differed because it was primarily an international question, while the other two problems were primarily domestic. By suspending the gold standard and establishing artificial control of foreign exchanges at the outbreak of the war, the belligerent countries made it possible for prices to rise at different rates in different countries. This can be seen in the fact that prices in Britain rose 200% in 7 years, 1913 to 1920, while in the United States they rose only 100%. The resulting disequilibrium had to be rectified before the two countries went back on the old gold standard, or the currencies would be valued in law in ratio quite differently from their value in goods. By going back on gold at the old ratios, 1 ounce of fine gold would, by law, become equal to $20.67 in the United States and about 84 shillings and 11.5 D in Britain for the $20.67 in the United States. You could get in 1920 about half of what you could have bought with in 1913 for the 84 shillings. In Britain, you could get in 1920 only about a third of what it would buy in 1913. The ounce of gold in the United States would be much more valuable than in Britain, so that foreigners and British would prefer to buy in the United States rather than in Britain, and gold would tend to flow to the United States from Britain, with goods flowing in the opposite direction. In such conditions, it would be said that the pound was overvalued and the dollar undervalued. The overvaluation would bring depression to Britain, while the United States would tend to be prosperous. Such disequilibrium of price parities could be adjusted by either a fall of prices in the country whose currency was overvalued, or by a rise in prices in the country whose currency was undervalued, or by both. Such an adjustment would be largely automatic, but at the cost of considerable flow of gold from the country whose currency was overvalued. Okay. Because the problem of price parities would either adjust itself or would require international agreement for its adjustment, no real attention was paid to it when governments turned their attention to the task of stabilization. Instead, they concentrated on the other two problems and, above all, devoted attention to the task of building up sufficient gold reserves to permit them to carry out the methods chosen in respect to these two problems. Most countries were in a hurry to stabilize their currencies when peace was signed in 1919. The difficulties of the three problems we have mentioned made it necessary to postpone the step for years. The process of stabilization was stretched over more than a decade from 1919 to 1931. Only the United States was able to return the gold standard at once, and this was the result of a peculiar combination of circumstances which existed only in that country. The United States had a plentiful supply of gold. In addition, it had a technological structure quite different from that of any other country, except perhaps Japan. American technology was advancing so rapidly in the period 1922 to 1928 that even with falling prices there was prosperity, since cost of production fell even faster. This situation was helped by the fact that prices of raw materials and food fell faster than prices of industrial products, so that production of these latter was very profitable. As a result, America achieved to a degree greater than any other country a solution of inflation and public debt, which all theorists had recognized as possible, but which none had known how to obtain the solution to be found in a great increase in real wealth. This increase made it possible simultaneously to pay off the public debt and reduce taxes. It also made it possible to have deflation without depression. A happier solution of the post-war problems could hardly have been found, for a time at least. In the long run, the situation had its drawbacks, since the facts that costs fell faster than prices and that prices of agricultural products and raw materials fell faster than prices of industrial products meant that in the long run the community would not have sufficient purchasing power to buy the products of the industrial organization. This problem was postponed for a considerable period by the application of easy credit and installment selling to the domestic market, by the extension to foreign countries of huge loans, which made it possible for these countries to buy the products of American industry without sending their own goods into the American markets in return. Thus, from the most unusual group of circumstances, the United States obtained an unusual boom of prosperity. These circumstances were, however, in many ways a postponement of difficulties rather than a solution of them, as the theoretical understanding of what was going on was still lacking. In other countries, the stabilization period was not so happy. In Britain, stabilization was reached by orthodox paths, that is, taxation as a cure for public debtors and deflation as a cure for inflation. These cures were believed necessary in order to go back on the old gold parity. Since Britain did not have an adequate supply of gold, the policies of deflation had to be pushed ruthlessly in order to reduce the volume of money in circulation to a quantity small enough to be superimposed on the small base of available gold at the old ratios. At the time, the policy was intended to drive British prices down to the level of world prices. The currency notes, which had been used to supplement banknotes, were retired, and credit was curtailed by raising the discount rate to panic level. The results were horrible. Business activity fell drastically, and unemployment rose to well over 1.5 million. The drastic fall in prices from 307 in 1920 to 197 in 1921 made production unprofitable unless the costs were driven down even faster. This could not be achieved because labor unions were determined that the burden of the deflationary policy should not be pushed onto them by forcing down wages. The outcome was a great wave of strikes and industrial unrest. The British government could measure the success of their deflation only by comparing their price levels with world price levels. This was done by means of the exchange ratio between the pound and the dollar. At that time, the dollar was the only important currency on gold. It was expected that the forcing down of prices in Britain would be reflected in an increase in the value of the pound in terms of dollars on the foreign exchange market. Thus, as the pound rose gradually upward towards the pre-war rate of $4.86, this rise would measure the fall in British prices downward to the American or the world price level. In general terms, this was true, but it failed to take into consideration the speculators who, knowing that the value of the pound was rising, sold dollars to buy pounds, thus pushing the dollar down and the pound upward faster than was justified in terms of the changes in price levels in the two countries. Thus, the pound rose $4.86, while the British price level had not yet fallen to the American price level, but the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Winston Churchill, judging the price level by the exchange rate, believed that it had went back on the gold standard at that point. As a result, sterling was overvalued and Britain found itself economically isolated on the price plateau. Above the world market on which she was economically dependent. All right. Give it a break there. I know it's only like halfway through. There's a bunch of pages left. All right, so that's page 333, finance, commercial policy, and business activity. Get more into it later. I gotta be honest. They just keep admitting that it's like a huge conspiracy of the bankers, and the bankers specifically want to control every government through, controlling the interest rate, controlling who gets the loans, and controlling the politicians through political, contributions, right? And whenever one country gets too much authority, or the citizens of the country get too much authority, then they like switch it around and move the money over here and move. It's ridiculous. It's a huge conspiracy. It is. I'm sorry. And it's like they're actively trying to make sure that like the lower and middle class people don't have enough money so that they can ever be politically effective. And it's ridiculous. They print money out of nothing. I mean, it says it right in that chapter. It's like they print the money out of nothing, and then they get real goods and economic activity.
All right. We'll get back to that later, I guess. Thanks for watching if you did. If you didn't, then you won't hear this. Have a good day and peace.